Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar, The Evolution of Workplace Violence, a 2022 Perspective. This event, brought to you by Security Magazine, is sponsored by Everbridge and Northland Controls. I'm your moderator, Maggie Shin, Chief Editor of Security Magazine. Thank you for joining us. Today's presenters are Charles Baxter, Security Consultant at Northland Controls, and Steve Cremando, Principal and Founder at Behavioral Science Applications. The format for this webinar will be a little different from what you're accustomed to. I will pose questions to our panel for discussion in a Q&A style format. Don't forget to submit your questions, and later in the program, our presenters will address as many as possible. Today's event is being recorded and archived on securitymagazine.com. Now let's start with our first question. Steve and Charles, there's a lot going on over the past couple of years and even the past week within the US and worldwide. So let's start there. How have changes in society contributed to the evolving threat landscape?
Charles, I don't know if you want to jump in first, but go ahead.
All right, Steve. So I think that a number of changes have brought about some of the added stress and the increase in workplace violence-related incidents. I think part of it is that employees in a COVID environment where companies are downsizing in large numbers, they're concerned about a disciplinary action or a layoff that could result in them being out of work. People are concerned about their personal situation. There's a lot of changes that are taking place as people are working from home, and the dynamic is changing where childcare is an issue because schools are closed. So in addition to work, now you're taking care of the needs of the family and in that dynamic. I think that the issue in regards to the just the stresses that associated with all of these changes, working remotely versus that one-on-one contact, I think that's making more people susceptible to something that's going to generate a workplace violence incident than we had previously seen. And then we take into account all of the issues relating to COVID, and not getting into the politics, but discussing how our views on COVID differ from person to person and how we respond to those issues. That's another factor. Even though that doesn't really relate specifically to a workplace incident, there's a ripple effect that does have a bearing.
So if I could add to that, I think about maybe 4 different areas that are really driving change around the threat landscape. And Charles touched on some of these, and I'll build a little further. First of all, to your opening question, many of our guests online today will recognize that we've just been through a really difficult weekend here in the U.S. in terms of mass violence. We had actually 96 different shooting events in the U.S. on Sunday alone that took the lives of 42 people and injured another 107. And we were actually up to, although they were not all mass shooting events, we're actually up to 120 mass shooting events so far this calendar year. So we're averaging somewhere between 30 and 40. So there's this big shift in more large cultural issues like civility and community cohesion in general. But we've become somewhat desensitized and almost expecting this violence in the backdrop. It's reached almost some from very, very difficult levels. And this is a question for sociologists and others about the big meaning. The idea about stress, though, is really important. And just 3 weeks ago, the American Psychological Association published their latest national survey. It's known as Stress in America. They said 7 out of 10 people, and these are all U.S. adults, said that they were overwhelmed by the cascading number of crises going on at the moment. So when we think about this kind of, the interaction between the person and their environment, we're in a really, really stressful environment. And yes, COVID remains a big piece of this, but it's the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's the economy, it's oil prices, it is all of these things. And again, remaining politically agnostic, we're coming into a really heated 2022 midterm election cycle in which it's likely to become even more divisive and more overheated. So there are these stresses that have evolved and become magnified over the last few years, and COVID really accelerated that, combined with the other things that COVID has done. We started to talk about changes in the workplace. There's a lot of employees right now who have never been to their office yet, who have been hired during COVID, who don't have that sense of community cohesion. And cohesion is one of the things that actually helps prevent violence. So when we think about the threat landscape, the fact that you don't know people the same way, don't have the same relationships and commitment, and this is not news. I mean, I think about going back to maybe, the early 2000s in the book, if you haven't seen it, Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, and really talked about how people don't have the same sense of joining organizations and civic groups and connections that they did. And that kind of slow erosion of cohesion, does contribute towards violence. And then the fast-paced erosion of cohesion we had when we had to isolate from each other, begin working in the hybrid environments, as Charles mentioned, that kind of really moves things along as well in terms of increasing risk. But there's one other that I want to add to the discussion early that has to do with our threat landscape. Right now, many of our Homeland Security agencies across the country, meaning not just U.S. Department of Homeland Security, but state-level fusion centers and so forth, are just catching up and producing and releasing their 2022 threat assessments. And we've seen over the 2 years this rise of domestic violent extremism kind of rivaling the external threats we had of foreign terrorism and so forth. Now, when people think about workplace violence, very often we're not thinking like extremism. We think of the 4 classic categories laid out by OSHA. But in the post 9/11 environment, there is this potential for ideological violence that can be directed towards an employer, that can come to a workplace. And when we start to think about the rise of domestic violent extremism, how many people in the workplace may be honestly at odds with their coworkers about their ideology, about their views, talking on the water cooler about different conspiracy theories, we have the possibility in the landscape now that didn't exist in the same way before of this sort of extremism creeping into the workplace and potentially representing a threat on the workplace violence landscape. So many things have happened in the near term, I mean, over the last 24 months. And then there were these other kind of slower moving changes in society that are, generational. But they're all kind of hitting at the same time. And there's all of these different things happening at the moment that have really pushed a lot of people right to the edge.
So we're talking about the threat landscape here and the evolution of workplace violence. I'd like to transition a bit and focus on bullying and sexual harassment of female employees within the workplace. Can you both speak to that and what you're seeing?
Well, I'll jump in to start this part of the discussion. And there's one notable change I'll mention first. And yes, when we have the things I mentioned earlier, the erosion of stress or the increase in stress, the erosion of cohesion, it lends itself to this sort of problem. And remember, we think of bullying and harassment as being part of the overall continuum of workplace violence. A lot of people, when we watch the news, you could have the impression that workplace violence is always gun violence, it always ends in fatalities and so forth. But if you think about the spectrum of violence, it begins on this end where the behavior could be verbal, it could be, physical in other ways other than gun violence. So this is one of the places where, you use the idea of, a rising tide rises all boats. When the tide of workplace violence is rising in these other domains like physical violence and gun violence, it's rising on this end of the spectrum as well. So we see 2 things. One that I'll speak about and one that, I'll leave open for discussion is in the hybrid environment, we saw a significant increase in calls for help around things like domestic violence. People were trapped at home with their abusers, people who used to get some degree of respite of coming to the office each day and getting away from someone in their home who might be a threat in that way. Really, again, so there's this idea that isolation in this way actually becomes a real incubator for potential, domestic violence, workplace violence of this type. Most of that, when we look at it statistically, unfortunately, is directed at females. Now, that's not to say that this sort of violence and bullying and harassment is exclusively a male to female sort of dynamic, but that's statistically the most likely. So that has increased in a number of different ways. And as some organizations decide to remain a worker home sort of operation, and some decide to go to hybrid, we know that's going to still affect the rates of that sort of workplace violence. And you have to remember, domestic violence is one of OSHA's 4 categories of workplace violence. We just have to, in this era, think about reversing the equation a little bit. We always talked about type 4 workplace violence as the potential of the violent abuser following their partner to the workplace. In this instance, we have the possibility of it staying at home and affecting the worker. And this is still workplace violence, even though someone might be in the comfort of their own home. So lots is shifting in this, this particular area about, misogynistic sort of violence, domestic and interpartner violence as it associates with workplace violence. And some of it ties back to the earlier question in terms of changes in people's stress levels. And that can be even within a home. Financial stress, everyone working from home, schooling from home, things of this nature.
I think that what people need to understand when it comes to bullying, and I'll talk about sexual harassment in a second, but when it comes to bullying, bullying is probably, as far as percentages, a substantially higher percentage of workplace violence incidents. It is also the least reported incident. Research by the Workplace Bullying Institute found that there were higher instances of bullying among remote employees, about 43%. And half of those experiences took place during virtual meetings. 10% during email. We're a little bit more aggressive when we're not in contact with somebody. But what do we mean by bullying? And we should probably drill down and say, well, okay, this is what we say when we're talking about bullying. It could be work sabotage. It could be threats, verbal abuse, humiliating behavior of any kind of intimidation, something that makes somebody feel uncomfortable in a work setting. The victims may be chosen by their gender or sexual orientation or race, but the levels of anxiety and depression, health issues that come from that are a ripple effect that will make an employee less productive, also make them less likely to report such incidents in an environment like we discussed in the previous question, where people are concerned about keeping their jobs. They're less likely to report such instances. So who are the people that are doing the bullying? Well, the statistics say about 65% of them are the bosses. Now, managers aren't immune. The managers probably make up about 40% of victims, at least in studies that go back as late as 2021. But most of the victims find that their coworkers are the ones that are committing those acts of bullying. And the workers that are dealing with those types of issues and the added stress are less likely to make reports to their employers that these things have occurred. About 60 million people annually report that they've been bullied in their workplace. About 94% of American workers have said that they have been bullied in the workplace at least once. 23% of employees said they've been bullied via an email, and 20% feel that they've been humiliated due to gossip and bullying that just even happens indirectly, where it's not directly towards them. About 17% say that they've been yelled at, whether it's by a coworker or by an employee that they work with, a customer that they deal with. So bullying is a significant issue, and I have found that people have become a little bit more aggressive in bullying in a remote environment where we're not in contact with people directly. And I'll let Steve chime in on that before we get into sexual assaults and sexual harassment.
Well, just always as the reminder that bullying does very often escalate into, more overt acts of physical violence. So from the employer's standpoint, to your point, Charles, although this may be reported less, some people tend to maybe write it off as being less serious on the continuum of workplace violence. It's very often precursor behavior, and it makes a lot of sense to pay good attention and nip it in the bud. as opposed to, allow that to really escalate further.
Yeah. And all good points. Sexual assault's a whole different ball game. The numbers there are pretty staggering. About 30,000 sexual assaults have been reported by women in the workplace annually. Now, this is the ones that have been reported. A lot of those are not reported for some of the reasons we mentioned previously. And this can be just in everything from an inappropriate contact or a comment that's made to straight up sexual assault. 23% of females who have been sexually harassed said that things have gotten worse since the pandemic has started. And half of those women have expressed some knowledge of being sexually harassed, sometimes or more often online than in direct contact because of the environment that we're in.
And really interesting, way to kind of maybe finish that thought is when we talk about sexual harassment, and goes back to our point I was speaking earlier about domestic and interpartner violence. Psychologically, the drivers of this are things like power and control. And during COVID and these other global stressors people are seeing, people have felt really powerless and out of control. And although it's a really counterproductive way to be trying to regain some sense of control, when people feel powerless and feel control slipping away, we see these type of dynamics very often start to escalate. And I think that may be, one of the contributing factors, not causal, but one of the things contributing.
Those are certainly concerning statistics, Charles. When we talk about workplace violence, sexual harassment and bullying is, of course, those are one type of incidents. You mentioned domestic violence, ideological conflict a little earlier. What other types of workplace violence incidents are on the rise?
There's probably a greater percentage, and we certainly see it in the news daily, of particular types of professionals that seem to be more victimized than others. And I will start off with the healthcare professionals, lots of sensitivity to that. COVID certainly has helped with that. But then the people that come in contact with the public, that public that's a little uneasy and dealing with a lot of different pressures. So delivery drivers, the public service personnel, law enforcement, people that work in customer service, those are the ones that are experiencing more reported workplace violence related issues than others. And then Steve mentioned the big one is domestic violence. When people that aren't used to being home together all day long, 24 hours a day, are now not only home together, but dealing with all of the added stresses that come from working from home and the domestic change in their relationship and their interaction with family and other obligations, that has brought on a significant rise in domestic violence issues.
So, when we think about workplace violence, if we go back to, again, OSHA's model, type 1 and type 2, for example, and Charles spoke a little bit about the type 2 in certain sectors like healthcare, law enforcement, and so forth. But in the type 1 sort of scenario where it's workplace violence that occurs during the commission of another crime, and very often that's places like a retail operation, it's businesses that operate late at night with cash on hand, things of that nature. We've seen two things happen. One is this change in kind of baseline incivility. How often during the pandemic did we see stories about people being punched out in the store for wearing or not wearing a mask, vaccinating or not vaccinating, all these different reasons. And then you see it in a more global way, and I'll just take it outside the context of the workplace for a moment, with attacks on the Asian American, Pacific Islander population, on other racially and ethnically motivated violence that's directed to people just simply walking down the street. But we see some of this spilling into violence in these retail operations, on other kind of job sites that's the commission of a crime. Beyond the incivility, we see an increase in things like smash and grab crimes, right? We saw a lot of this in the West Coast, in California, places in New York City, Philadelphia as well, an increase in that kind of crime. And that kind of associates with what we have had across the country, which is a general rise in crime, a rise in violence, and those things then trickle kind of across all domains of workplace violence. But the reason I bring this up is very often when you hear, most people, and I know we're speaking to a very elite audience today, but when the public hears about a clerk being beaten up in the convenience store, that's usually not reported as workplace violence. That's something else. If you're the clerk working in the store, that's obviously your workplace, and this escalates as well. So as we see general themes in community crime and incivility kind of escalate, which they have, some of that trickles into these, type 1 environments, the retail environments. The other thing, which is similar to this, that ties back to Charles's piece about type 2, which is very often that patient, customer, client initiated violence that someone experiences while they're delivering services. And Charles's example was the healthcare. Customers are frazzled. People are in general at their wits' end, and moving beyond just being dissatisfied, very often taking action. So here, whether it's verbal abuse with a customer service representative on the phone, threats of violence made to customer service operations. And I know in my practice, we've seen a lot of that over the last year, where organizations are receiving more telephone threats and email threats, things of this nature. Customers and clients, which are the base population around us, also at their wits' end and not knowing, not again working or dealing with their stress in healthier, productive ways that they may have done in the past. So there is some escalation across all of these different types and all these different sectors that associates with some of the background changes that we've spoken about. But there probably is not a type of industry at this point or sector that hasn't experienced some increase in probably all 5 of those types of violence risks.
Yeah, and Steve brings on some great points. The number of reported issues are minimized. Employers don't necessarily look at some situations of workplace violence, and otherwise they're not always captured. So some of the information, even though it's pretty staggering when you think of the percentages and the increases in workplace violence related incidents, really is just a fraction, because we're only gathering information from what is reported.
One of the questions we hear often from business leaders, security leaders, and our readers is the question of duty of care and whether that has changed at all for organizations with more employees working from home. What are both of your thoughts there? And if an employer's duty of care has changed, tell me how.
Charles, you want to jump in first?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think the biggest thing that we have to realize is that if employers are requiring employees to work from home or providing them that option, what they've done is they have extended their workplace to wherever that employee is operating. If it's out of their home or out of Starbucks, wherever that employee is doing work, that is the employee's office. There is a certain duty of care that relates to workplace security, including the risk of violence, that has now shifted from the office where the employee had been working to a private residence or another location. We can talk about some of the remote locations that also come into play with this. But when it comes down to it, not only is it best practice to provide some type of training to employees on their responsibilities for their own safety and reporting mechanisms when incidents occur when they're not in the workplace. But the bottom line is that OSHA does have a general duty clause, and the general duty clause is rather wide in its scope and covers just about anything relating to employee safety that is not necessarily written in a specific policy. The strange thing about many surveys that have been conducted with HR professionals is more than half don't know that their company has necessarily an adequate policy on how to report workplace violence incidents, having an adequate violence prevention program, or if they have one, they haven't tested it. So that in itself is what problem number one. Problem number two is that if there is one that's in place, it hasn't been conveyed to the employees adequately. So if there is an incident, whether the employee is a victim themselves, the employee sees something, the employee otherwise hears about something, there's not necessarily a mechanism for one, identifying a policy, two, for reporting or doing any follow-up. OSHA says that about 1/4 of workplace violence incidents are never reported by employers when they are brought to their attention. So that in itself certainly is a bad thing when it comes to documenting those incidents if the employers aren't taking it safely or seriously. But employers traditionally only about half the time take appropriate action when they are brought to their attention. Only about 25% of companies have a zero tolerance policy when it comes to workplace related types of issues, including bullying. And about half of all companies that have been surveyed recently will implement some type of procedure to mitigate future incidents once something is brought to their attention that they have dealt with.
So, kind of to build on Charles's points, probably what is most important at the moment is it looks like hybrid work, at least, is here to stay. In that, organizations do need to continue to mature when they do have policies, procedures, training, all the things that Charles mentioned, to adapt them to this new reality, because there's really two ends of that, both that were touched on. One, from the employer's standpoint, that idea that even though it may be someone's personal home, it's the employer's workplace. As Charles brought up, if there's an expectation that you're going to be on the phone, on your computer from, this time to that, you're on the job as per the, OSHA's general duty clause. And as such, all the same duties extend. But the risks are different. One, the risk shifts, and Charles said this, when the employee moves to the home, it doesn't mean workplace violence risks evaporate. They just shift. They follow the employee, but they also change. One of the things that's interesting, and this goes back to the point about it being a two-factor equation. The employer and the employee both have responsibilities and action steps. When people are in the comfort of their own home, there's just a natural complacency. There's a somewhat of an illusion of complete safety. When you're in the workplace, there are probably much greater protections in many, if not most, workplaces. There may be some security to different levels coming through access points, security cameras, personnel, and if nothing else, eyes. You have coworkers and supervisors who are a force multiplier and looking out for a few things. So let's say, for example, if we're talking about the classic, OSHA type 3 workplace violence, which is worker to worker, or current or former employee to employee and such, we could have an employee working from home who, for a lack of better terms, is coming off the rails, who is not responding well to stress, who is deteriorating. In the workplace, sitting in their cubicle or some other fashion, people are interacting with them, seeing them, might notice those changes and maybe help move that person some help. If most of our interactions are in this domain, someone could pull it together for a 20-minute Zoom meeting, and coworkers and supervisors may not at all realize what level of distress they're in. So the training needs to go beyond, and the orientation for both employer and employees is, what does workplace violence look like in this new setting? And it's not a direct correlation to what it looked like in offices and manufacturing and other sorts of work settings. It changes because of the site, the complacency, the psychological factors, and it is very hard psychologically to get employees to start thinking, oh, I need a safety plan. I need to think about run, hide, and fight at home. What if a hostile person came to my doorstep related to my work? Folks, I don't have to tell anybody here how easy it is to find someone and where they live today online. And if you have a disgruntled employee, a hostile customer, or someone else, they can find someone at home just as easily. And I'll tell you, as an aside, as a young, much younger person, one of my first cases working here, and I'm outside of New York City, was on a case where the Unabomber found an advertising executive at home in Newark, Jersey. I got that package delivered to him, and he was killed at his kitchen table on a Saturday morning. It was related to his employment and what he was doing for, that offended the Unabomber. So workplace violence can and does find people in the home. Workplace violence, again, looks differently in some ways. And employers, again, if nothing else, I think the operative word right now is mature. Need to start thinking about maturing all that Charles mentioned, the policies, the plans, the trainings, to what are the new dynamics in the home or hybrid environment. How do we get employees in the proper mindset to understand what their part of the equation is? We could give folks checklists to do a safety check of their house, things like that. But how do you affect the mindset that I'm on the job, this is a workplace, and some risks can still find me here in my pajamas and my fuzzy bunny slippers, regardless if I'm behind, the doors of 12 Main Street. So a very different environment, and we need to grow up with that new change, all of us.
Yeah, Steve and I do presentations like this all the time for a lot of different groups, and sometimes we're able to drill down as we're dealing with a particular audience. So we're speaking in general terms, but generality is having some type of security awareness program at the company level, and that in our new normal, that should extend to a work from home policy relating to safety and security awareness for those people that are working at home or working in an area that is outside their normal office. And the company has a responsibility to do that. They need to talk about how each employee should secure their workspace, what to do if an incident occurs, make sure that they reevaluate that policy or training on a regular basis. And they need to convey that. I will profess that companies are not as good at doing basic security awareness training upon onboarding or ongoing safety awareness training for employees on a regular basis, as we're starting to do more and more for IT, to have people watching for things to be careful of when they're logging into the computer. The same thing is true while somebody is using their computer, whether it's at home or in a transitional space. Training should include bullying and harassment, the discrimination, the things that Steve and I mentioned previously, and be able to provide resources. The big thing is not only having a plan and conveying the plan, but practicing the plan to make sure that it makes sense. And if you do have policy and you do have training, it needs to be constantly evaluated to make sure that it is still current and provides the best resources for the employees and looks out for the safety of the employee. Employees need to know what to do when they're threatened. They need to know who to talk to, how to make a report, and how to be more aware of their surroundings and their environment to prevent things from occurring when it's possible.
So we just spoke on the employer side of things when we're talking about an increase in employees working remotely or in a hybrid setting. Do you think working from home has changed or increased employee awareness of safety in their workplace at all?
I think at the very beginning of the COVID experience, and people transitioned quickly to home, there was a lot of discussion of, for example, cybersecurity and how to work safely with the VPNs and even guard, confidential information that would be left on your desktop or thumb drives, things around the house. I don't know that the same level of kind of physical security and violence prevention discussion happened. That's been my opinion. I think, as I said, we're kind of fighting a little bit of a tide, even still now, that people feel this somewhat sense of complacency and even an invulnerability in their own homes. But it is I think, as I said, kind of an evolution or a maturity that at some point both employer and employee totally get it, that this is a legit workplace when I'm at home, and all the same forms, in fact, all 5 types of identified workplace violence, they can happen in the home as well, ranging from someone being at home during a theft, burglary, home invasion, up to my example with the Unabomber, some form of extremism or violent extremism that finds an employee home and targets them because of what their company does or what their company represents. So this is, I think, a process. I have to say, in my opinion, when I speak to leaders in companies, when I speak to audiences, I don't think we're there yet. I don't think that the majority of employers or employees totally get how violence threats can saturate into the home work environment. And one last example before I pass this to Charles is we talk about active shooter. I mentioned in my opening comments the number of statistics of how many people were shot over the last weekend. Many of those happened in residence. Now, they're not the classic active shooter scenario where the shooter is looking for, large numbers of casualties and it's random, victim selection. But the home office is not immune in any way from the same sort of gun violence. And again, remaining agnostic on this, it is well known that gun ownership has increased dramatically over the last few years. And we know that, the whole balance of that sort of extreme violence can shift as the culture shifts, as ownership changes, things like that. So I know that's a kind of a loaded comment. Lots of people have strong feelings about that. Again, not saying this is causal, but these are all factors that kind of enter the mix. And as I said, I think we have a way to go in terms of maturing or evolving our thinking about workplace violence and even something like active shooter scenarios that could potentially affect hybrid workers and homebound workers.
It's funny that about 75% of remote workers say they feel less safe going back to the office. Many employees said if they were forced to go back into brick and mortar, they would find another job where they wouldn't have to. But think about what you do in most environments. And let's say this is a typical environment that has some security awareness training for employees. You may have a key to get into the building. You may have an access badge. You may have to wear an ID card as you're walking from space to space and swipe your badge to get into those critical areas. We have controlled parking areas where you have to swipe a badge or punch in a keypad in order to park into a secure area. But now you're at home. And if you're in your PJs and in Steve's instance, wearing his bunny slippers, you're sitting at home and the last thing you're thinking about is your security. You become very complacent in your home environment, not even thinking that the things that you're doing at work, the things that you're working on your computer, the calls that you're making, the people that are walking by and able to look into a window or walk into a room where you're doing work, now make you vulnerable. You don't think in those terms. And I'll tell you when we really don't think about it, we don't think about it at home, but we definitely don't think about it when we're in transitional spaces. And a transitional space could be you're sitting at Starbucks and you're doing your Zoom call and anybody sitting around you can look at your computer screen, hear your conversation. I see the same thing on airplanes all the time as people are opening up laptops in a crowded airplane and are working on sensitive material, not even understanding that anybody sitting around them has the opportunity to look at anything that they're looking at. So has the working from home or working remotely increased employee awareness? No, I think that we have become more complacent. We're in our home environment. We feel comfortable here. We don't think about the sensitivity of our work and the work things that we're dealing with that really aren't meant to be seen by the public. We don't log off our computers because we think we're home. We don't pay attention to our surroundings when we're in an environment other than in the office. But if we were in the office, there would be a whole different set of protocols and a whole different mindset that needs to be conveyed to employees when they are working remotely.
And there's a whole structure there as well. As you said, the access card reader, the cameras, the security guard, all of that there as well. I actually just had an interesting reminder as we're in the middle of this conversation. And that has to do with something, for example, like mail security. You're getting mail at your office. Good chance it went to the mail room. People in the mail room handling that have had some instruction, or there's a poster on the wall from the Postal Service about looking out for suspicious packages. No mail security. I'm at home. I'm working from home right now during this broadcast. I just got a little alert from Ring that there's a package dropped on my front porch. I got to tell you, I don't remember if myself, my wife, my kids ordered anything. I have no idea what that is. So here again, all of that security, whether it's cybersecurity, it is physical security, it is mail security, we are not yet at a place, I think, where employees and employers are fully getting it, or at least on the same page. As per that one statistic Charles mentioned about people feeling less safe going back to the physical office, there's probably a lot more protections for them there. Yet that mindset is, I'm home, I'm safe, and nothing happens here, right? So there's all those cognitive biases, normalcy biases, and so forth, that kind of leads us to think that it's all good here, nothing to worry about. And I hate to think that this has to come from us learning of cases where things have gone wrong, but the reality is, tragedy drives innovation, and sometimes we have to wait to hear those stories before people wake up and say, wow, working at home may have its own risks, and we all need employer-employee to be taking those a little more seriously.
Those are interesting points. As organizations are thinking about workplace violence and prevention, are there behavior indicators that might suggest potential for workplace violence that you can share?
Well, there's a long list, and they've been well publicized about all the different sorts of behavioral changes. And I don't know that either Charles or I need to go through that whole sort of list, but the big thing, of course, that usually summarizes most of those different behaviors, or change, some sort of sudden, dramatic, or observable change that could do with communications, relationships, substance consumption, all these different things, but something becomes really obvious. Now, I want to circle this back, your question back to something Charles had said earlier about the importance of training both employees, supervisors, everyone else in the chain about workplace violence, about policy and such. In those sorts of trainings, we talk about indicators always. These are the things you're looking for. And we know that violence prevention works best through three filters. Self-awareness, when I know I'm really struggling and I could reach out maybe to an employee assistance program or some mechanism to get help. Buddy care, in which my coworkers and my supervisors may see myself or someone else struggling and raises the alert that there's problems. And lastly, at the supervisory level, a supervisor who's looking at the big picture, not just at individual changes in an employee, but also in a team or a unit, also levels of stress in the organization, and looking at that for violence risk. But now, thinking about where we are today, going back to, for example, the hybrid environment, I think both employees, as that first line of self-defense, supervisors especially, benefit from some discussion about what does change look like in this new world of work. What does it look like if I'm only talking to an employee remotely? How would I recognize change? How would I recognize if their demeanor is different, grooming is different, posture is different, the level of energy, the level of engagement? How would I notice that? And would I know how to reach out to that employee and say, hey, are you okay? You seem different this week. Do you have time after the meeting for a call, right? So this idea of supportive acknowledgement, I acknowledge I see some sort of change in you. I want to support you and see what that is and see if you need any sort of help. So I think we have probably done a really good job in the violence prevention industry over 20 plus years of sharing the news about what the individual indicators look like, things of that nature. But right now, I think there's a real importance in transitioning that and helping the people who would be watchers, who might spot this, to understand how they might look differently in this new world and what to do about it in this new dynamic as well. So that's kind of my perspective.
Yeah, I think that's right on the money. I think that it's being sensitive to change and taking action when you see change in behavior, especially in this particular case where we're talking someone that might have the potential for violence, aggressive behavior. But one is recognizing it, and then two, as Steve said, taking some action, pulling that person aside. Are you okay? And if there are indications that maybe they're not okay and there's some additional action to be taken, the company should have resources and encourage employees to utilize those resources that are being provided in order to address some of those behaviors.
Yeah, as an extension of that, that same training then for managers are looking for other behavioral cues, like this person may be experiencing domestic violence at home. What would the indicators of that be? This person may be starting to be interested in extremist ideology, and there's something I see in the room. There's something in a phrase they use. There's something they're wearing that should get my attention. So I think it's really twofold. It's one, what are the behavioral indicators of all the different types of workplace violence, not just the one that may come as an insider threat, worker to worker, worker to supervisor, but what would be kind of signs, symptoms, or signals of these other types of violence too, including the domestic violence scenario, extremism, and the whole range. So there's a lot of, I would say, re-education, or if not that, maybe a recalibration of the messages that we share in terms of what are the indicators. Workplace violence is morphing with our changing workplace. Workplace violence, as it changes, the indications of that, they're going to continue to change as well. So, I mean, to kind of wrap up my perspective, the workplace violence training we did for an organization 5 and 10 years ago, it really needs to be dusted off and revisited because the world has changed a lot in the last 2.5 years.
Yeah, and I think that the company needs to underscore that it's committed to combating workplace violence, whether it's at home or in the office. And if there is a no threats, or if there isn't a no threats or no violence policy, there should be one. And employees should, if there is a policy that's in place and it's been updated, it needs to be provided to the workplace. The workforce needs to know that, one, the company is committed. Here's what the policy is. Here's how we handle these situations. If you are a victim, if you need help, here are the resources that are available. But I think that those, and then also providing those employees that witness an incident of workplace violence, or if they get a sense that something's not right with an employee, to be able to help them understand warning signs and then what to do when they see those warning signs. Also, let's look out for the victim. There are things that a victim can be trained in to help soften a violent incident or the harassment and the bullying so it doesn't continue to escalate through words and actions, as well as a reporting process. So there's a number of things that can be done, but I think Steve's point from the get-go is the most important. When you see an employee behavior changes, whether it become more aggressive or more submissive, that's an indication that there might be an issue that needs to be addressed. We need to be sensitive to that. We need to take action.
We talked about the victim side of this a little bit in terms of change that you both mentioned. What about on the aggressor side? Are there signs or indicators there?
Well, let me just clarify. Are we talking right now about the violent actor or the employee who might be a victim? Which do we want to focus at the moment?
Yeah, let's focus a little bit more on the victim.
So, I guess it depends to some degree with those indicators on what type of violence that may be. But back to the idea of behavioral change. Behavioral change always means something. It doesn't always mean something negative or violent, but it's always meaningful. The problem we very often have is one that we don't want to rock the boat, right? We see small changes and we're not sure what they mean, so we tend not to go poke the bear and see what happens. When we talk about an employee who might be the victim, to Charles's point, there tends to be 3 possible scenarios. One is the person who just wants to leave. And this can affect, of course, retention and recruitment and all these things for an organization where they feel like, hey, this stuff happens here. The culture, the climate breeds this sort of problem. The employer doesn't put an end to it. I don't want to be part of this. So obviously, as we look at exit strategies and people who are leaving the workforce, a question that should be on the mind of employers is the culture in some way driving people out because they're uncomfortable or fearful? The other 2 options are essentially the fight or freeze option. And the fight option would be the person who starts to become more agitated, more angry, more animated themselves because they feel a need to kind of push back and fight back in different ways. And the other person is going to be intimidated by everything that's going on and in some ways probably duck and cover. And that could be, exhibited as more absenteeism, less participation in everything to do with work. It could be disconnecting from relationships that were valuable for them. And as I said earlier, it could be just a general decrease in their level of energy or engagement in everything to do. But they start to experience the work environment and the work as negative and threatening. And the normal human response is to put distance between ourselves and the threat. So some way we start to see this distancing behavior that's reactive to someone feeling threatened in some way, psychologically and or physically. So it cycles back a little bit to the idea of observable change.
Do you have anything you'd like to add, Charles?
Well, I'm going to come back on training again because I just find that is one thing that many organizations don't put into place. There's going to be some mandates that'll be coming out. The general duty clause that OSHA has will certainly be a catch-all for anything. But let me give you one example where there has been some significant change, and it's coming about effective July 1st, and it's being initiated by the Joint Commission. And if those of you that are not in the healthcare industry, the Joint Commission has been around since about the early 1950s. It accredits over, I'd say 20,000 healthcare organizations and programs, and they're responsible for creating and maintaining a culture of safety throughout the hospital. We obviously know that right now that is a very critical area. We see all the time about healthcare workers that have been victimized, those people supporting them, including the security officers that are only responsible for the facility, being assaulted by the folks that are going to the hospital or have other actions that take place at the hospital. So anyway, effective July 1st, there is some mandates as far as workplace violence prevention programs that is going to be mandatory for everybody. And so let me read through my notes, and I'm going to cover some of the subject matter because I think that the subject matter itself has universal appeal to everybody, but it's an indication in this case and in the healthcare environment that they are taking more aggressive action to ensure the safety of healthcare workers in that environment. So policies and procedures to prevent and respond to workplace violence. Incident reporting process to follow up and support the victims and witnesses affected by workplace violence, including trauma and psychological counseling when it's necessary. The reporting of workplace violence incidents to a governing body. Annual assessments to determine effectiveness of the program and act on findings. Recognition of what constitutes workplace violence begins with awareness of the different types of physical and non-physical acts and threats of workplace violence. Additionally, education and training should focus on what constitutes workplace violence, roles and responsibilities of leadership, clinical staff, security personnel, and external law enforcement, de-escalation techniques, non-physical intervention skills, physical intervention techniques, response to emergency incidents, and lastly, a reporting process for workplace violent incidents. A lot of common sense in that, but as a guideline, this would be the elements that I would expect to see in any company's program when they want to mitigate violent incidents.
Thank you both for a great discussion. Before we have Charles and Steve address, we have many questions that have been submitted throughout the program. I want to remind you that we love your feedback in our webinar survey to help us improve our programs. And now let's take one of the first questions here. How does the security risk assessment process change as a result of this remote working, the increase in remote work?
I'm going to just touch on that for a second because I think Charles probably has even a greater sense of this than myself. But, we talked about that recalibration and the mindset that employees take on, that they still have these risks when they're working from home. One of the things we've done, I know, with our clients is provide things like checklists that an employee can do to look at their home environment. That could be kind of the basic, like crime prevention to environmental design ideas, things about lighting and the shrubs outside their house and fire safety and electrical safety, all these different kinds of things that can empower an employee to really start taking some ownership of the physical security in their environment. But I know that's actually more in Charles's wheelhouse, so I'm going to leave it at that for now.
Hey, but you're right on the money. I mean, you could just take it from there. As far as the risk assessment goes, risk assessments is something that every company should do as a matter of routine, whether it's to comply with regulatory standards associated with a particular line of business, or it's just good practice. But when it comes to a risk assessment, we're now going to take the physical brick and mortar where the employee has been working, and we're going to extend that. As we're traveling, we need to be able to provide our risk assessment to address traveling. We need to be able to address our risk assessment to people that are working from home. We need to address our risk assessment to transitional spaces. People leaving their computer in their car while they're in shopping in plain view is probably a bad idea. It's vulnerable. That's a risk. Some of that is education, but we have to identify the risks to know how we can best inform the employees on what's acceptable behavior and how we can mitigate loss.
Here's another one. Should companies enforce certain types of physical security measures at home to mitigate those risks, such as locks, biometrics, etc.?
Again, I'll touch on it very quickly, back to Charles. I think historically it's been tougher for companies to enforce what people do at home. It's harder to know that they do it for sure. It's harder to force them because, as I said, there is this balance where it's the person's home, but it's the company's workplace. There's a logic to that. The enforcement piece, I think, is where it gets sticky.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that when people started working from home, one of the questions from a safety perspective is to ensure that they're following good safety practices at home. You're sitting in a ergonomically correct seated position or standing position. You're using the right keyboard and mouse orientation. And during the course of your workday, you're not going out and changing the oil in your car where an accident might occur because you're on the company clock. The same thing holds true for your security and your security awareness. You don't want to not be aware of the surroundings around your house, the people that have access to your computer or sensitive data, a clean desk policy, so documents that are sensitive in nature that aren't for public dissemination should not be left out on a desk or an area where anybody who is not authorized to be able to look at that. And so is there punitive relating to that? Well, if those items become vulnerable, then yes, there probably is going to be some ramifications. But I don't think in the environment, as we discussed earlier, of complacency working from home, that we have necessarily been as efficient in conveying to employees what is acceptable and to make them aware of some of those areas that they may take as not that important when they're working in the home environment.
Let's touch on reporting. Someone is asking, how can you get employees to report sexual harassment or other types of workplace violence? Do you have any suggestions for best practices?
Historically, the recommendation around that is to continue to raise awareness and make sure the culture is sensitized to that, and the culture and leadership, are always conveying that sort of message. There's a number of ways that could be done through annual trainings, through awareness things, through having partners from the community, different violence prevention partners, give presentations, have a table in the hallway at lunch. There's so many different ways, but you have to keep it in people's really top of mind, because when that happens, very often people are just outright stunned and not sure what to do or how to handle it. So they need to have some level of familiarity so they can fall back to what they've heard, what they know, what the culture has taught them about this if they're going to react to it quickly and properly.
Yeah, the magic word I think that came from that was from Steve's comment was culture, because the culture of the organization from the top down needs to be zero tolerance when it comes to that type of behavior. It's zero tolerance and an aggressive enforcement posture when those types of issues that violate company policy and put other employees at risk are addressed promptly and efficiently. And that's how you curtail those types of issues. But it has to be a culture that really starts at the top and trickles all the way down. If you don't have the support at the top, then you're going to have a weak program that's never going to be effective.
Thank you both. That's all the time we have for questions today. Please join me in thanking Charles Baxter and Steve Cremando for their presentation, as well as our sponsors, Everbridge and Northland Controls. If you have any additional questions or comments, please don't hesitate to click the Email Us button on the console. Please visit securitymagazine.com for the archive of this presentation, as well as information about upcoming events. We appreciate your time and hope you found this webinar to be a valuable experience.